Chapter 34. Political Conversion. In a larger society, our individual voice and influence concerning circumstances that affect us may lose effectiveness and efficiency among a multiplicity of other individuals. It appears necessary that we organize with other individuals who possess the same or similar interests to look after ourselves and our interests and to participate in cooperative achievements. We may associate to better conduct the environment in which we live into directions that are beneficial or at least not damaging for our interests. The number of individuals associated with interests grants legitimization to interests not only because it gives rise to a presumption that they represent defensible positions. Widely held interests will also command more respect because the larger amalgamation of interested individuals poses a more credible threat to others if their demands are not accommodated. In a strict competitively oriented society, the ruling powers may not tolerate other interest groups or may control these closely. In a nominally cooperative society, competitive rulers may have to countenance such groups and make allowances to maintain their appearance of cooperativity. A more cooperatively oriented society may admit interest groups but control their behavior through regulations that are designed to prevent them from behaving competitively and to encourage resolution of their differences. Yet interest groups present powerful mechanisms that threaten to break out of any containment. If a system does not adequately support and protect the happiness of members, they are prone to organize and pursue adjustments. In the event procedural and substantive laws do not adequately accommodate participants' interests, they may take competitive action to insist on their claimed rights. Even short of such activities, a lack of reconciliation among dissenting groups may cause opposition or disengagement, that may impair a system's effectiveness or efficiency. The suppression, elimination, or dissociation of such groups may incite additional negative consequences. Their potential to cause trouble and resist translates into how important it is to accommodate them. Joining forces in interest groups then appears to be an essential requirement in settings where interests compete, if only for defensive purposes. But it might also seem to be a helpful and possibly required activity to organize and back up interests in a cooperative society. In competitively oriented societies, interest groups might find a natural positioning among other parties that compete for power and position. However, their presence in cooperative societies may pose a threat. The basis for this threat can be found in the narrowly defined objectives and pursuits of interest groups. This limitation is often self-imposed. The focus on a narrowly defined purpose allows an organization to place all its strength and effort into the pursuit of certain matters and to pursue such matters with a minimum of compromise. The representation or accommodation of other interests may diminish its effectiveness and efficiency. Acknowledging diversity in its membership might limit its ability to decisively speak and act on behalf of its members. To be the most productive in the promotion of an interest groups may deem that they cannot afford to be microcosms of society. If members wish an interest group to prosecute interests with maximum impact, as might be necessary in a contest with other interests, they might permit its representation of their interests to separate from the concert of their individual pursuits. They might agree to the establishment of an organization that replicates neither their internal complexities nor the differences among its members' dispositions and situations. The unmitigated focus of interest groups instills a tendency in them to engage in their mission with competitive commitment. The same qualities that make them capable contestants in a society tend to render them incompetent participants in negotiated settlements. They are prone to prosecute their purpose without regard for other needs of their members, for non-members, and for achieving an overall maximization of happiness in their society. They may follow their program relentlessly and with ideological conviction, trying to push non-coinciding interests aside or to vanquish them if these mount opposition. If interest groups are designed as rational, practical tools for the fulfillment of particular needs or wishes, one might presume that their members might not carry much emotional allegiance toward them or to their fellow members. But entering and maintaining a membership in a group to pursue a need better demonstrate members' desire and an actual or a feared level of deprivation regarding particular needs or wishes. Depending on these needs or wishes and their fulfillment status, the security of their fulfillment, and the function that an interest group assumes in their pursuit, members may have a strong emotional investment in its mission. The intensity of their concern may establish the driving force behind entering into an interest group, and allowing it to pursue its objectives with zealous partiality. The commonality of an objective arising from shared deprivation or a shared fear of deprivation and the joint pursuit and achievement of that objective against the opposition or a lack of consideration by other societal forces may engender tribal loyalty among members and to the organization. That loyalty may be particularly strong because a narrowly defined mission of the group gives members an unrealistic impression of unity in personalities and circumstances. Contentions with other interest groups or wider societal interests are bound to add tribal emotionality. Such an emotional charge by members might further radicalize the uncompromising demeanor of interest groups. The emotional tribalization of interest groups may influence members to allow the representation of their concerns in manners that interfere with their reasonable pursuit in the context of members' other needs. Even if members realize such an overemphasis, they may excuse it by a threatened or actual societal underrepresentation of their represented interest. Besides that, members may not dare to deviate for fear of breaking their loyalty to other members and the group. Hence, the competitive character of an interest group may not find meaningful containment by its members. Even if members do not become emotionally involved, to a disproportional degree, the struggle against other interest groups that operate without scruples may prompt members to leave groups that represent their interests free to reply in kind. Hamstringing these groups might hinder them to win or to merely hold their ground in a competitive fight. The concept of interest groups suggests most directly that individuals who share particular wishes or needs join for their better pursuit. While such improvement may seem generally positive, their narrowly focused, radical attitude of specific interest partitions threatens to charge human interaction with non-traditional forms of tribal competition. But more general interest groups may also form or continue because of differentiations among groups that are embedded in a society on consequence of the enlargement and combination of tribal systems. Tribes may merge or may be forcibly merged into larger organizations that progress into states, countries, federations of countries or merged unions. This amalgamation of tribes into greater societies may increase stability among them. However, that growth may come at the cost of an attenuated quality or a failure of the extension of traditional tribal bonds to certain members, groups, or the entirety of the greater system. Individuals may develop tribal allegiances toward larger amalgamations founded on shared ethnic, cultural, religious, territorial, or other identity, shared experiences, or shared purposes. Still, traditional tribal bonds may persist to govern members' emotional societal attachment parallel an allegiance to a greater amalgamation of tribes. In addition, tribal entities might reserve some governmental powers and a right of participation in the management of the greater scheme they enter. Even where former tribal entities do not officially retain powers, they might retain importance if the larger system into which they are embedded does not provide administration to the contentment of the members of such units. Moreover, the larger size of systems may make it necessary for traditional tribes that are placed in a system to organize, so they can secure their interests in an expanded context. Interest groups and associations may be vestiges of independent tribal systems that endeavor to hold on to autonomous structures and processes and defend these and other interests in a larger context. Communities resembling traditional tribal establishments may further newly form due to population growth, dispersion, or other traditional criteria for tribal differentiation. They may also arise due to new qualities of shared differentiations. In all these incidents, resulting interest groups may represent multiple concerns of their members that may range to the original comprehensive organizational model of tribes. What makes them interest groups is not the type of interests they represent, but that the organization and pursuit of these interests are separate from other interests in a society, and that they are held in a position of priority over the interests of the remainder of a greater society. In this quality, they join interest groups that are formed according to a narrower scope of needs and wishes and deviate from traditional tribal organization. The narrow focus sustained by interest groups in the representation of their cause establishes an inherent antagonism toward other individuals, groups, or systems that do not share their positions. They are prone to represent their viewpoint or the transformation of a society in line with that viewpoint at the cost of other interests. This competitive antagonism is likely to be countered in kind by interests that are negatively affected by an interest group's strategies. The resulting contest among interest groups is very different from the idea that the concert of represented legitimate interests might assist in reconciling them to maximize the overall advancement of happiness in a society. The aggressive stance of interest groups converts what was to be a cooperative environment of calm discourse, mutual consideration, and a commonly carried compromise that assists an overall best solution for the entirety of a society into an arena for competitive combat. Interest groups may phrase their undertakings in cooperative terminology and a pretense of cooperative intent to evade defensive mechanisms that a broader awareness of their exclusionary and predatory activities might evoke. They might pay tribute to a cooperative setting in as far as this is necessary or helpful to maintain a cooperative pretense. They might engage to some extent in collective reconciliation of their interests to increase their cover or where that otherwise promotes their interests. Yet behind their appearance as cooperative contributors to public discourse and decision-making, they aim at maximizing their competitive success. Thus, interest groups reveal themselves as classic competitors whose threat is only modulated by a possibly more limited agenda. Arguably, the competitive orientation of interest groups might be averted if members involved themselves in their direction. Such an involvement might afford members with a level of awareness that may inspire them to bring the pursuit of interests by these organizations in conformance with the full scope of members' needs. Then again, their personal involvement might not change their commitment to the represented cause. Some interest groups may be fully cooperative among their members and represent their intent without adulteration. They may have the character of a cooperative society that acts competitively toward its environment. Beyond that, members' involvement may be attenuated or obstructed because interest groups may have hierarchic structures and processes due to instinctive reactions from members to competition by or toward their group. Because interest groups are established to battle with other interests, that competition might motivate their hierarchic organization from the start. By this organization, members voluntarily bar their management of the group. Such groups may be led by small elites. Even if interest groups are less stringently organized, they might filter the will of members through a representational system. Members may appoint representatives to manage affairs of the group on their behalf. That may particularly apply to functions calling for special skills or to which members cannot or are not willing to devote much attention or other resources. The appointment of representatives to pursue interests in members' stead may be the most attractive aspect of interest groups for members besides the increase of their influence through their combination and organization. Members' missing ability or willingness to conduct the business of an interest group stands in contrast to its task of effective and efficient representation. Members therefore often depend on professional management to undertake an interest group's objectives. That institutionalization and detached administration may be an additional factor in segregating its mission from the context of its members' endeavors, particularly if they have not defined that mission carefully in reference to that context. But detachment may also allow professional management to redefine a group's objectives and practices of pursuit in spite of express directions. Even if members are able and willing to participate, and even if their interest group's present structures and processes for participation, the disconnected position of members may prevent them from forming a sufficient momentum and clarity in their intent without the support by management. That may not pose a problem in groups with regular communication opportunities among members as a result of their vicinity or conduct. However, if the concerns an interest group represents are so specialized that members might not regularly meet or have the opportunity to meet one another, management of that group is placed in a relay position for communications and the forming of instructions by the members. Unless these activities are reinforced by management, members may have difficulties to effectively combine. To interject themselves sufficiently, members might have to first organize separately from the interest group. Such an impediment might discourage members because it would mean to act contrary to their objectives to place the burden of pursuing the involved interests on an agent. Even if interest groups enable member influence, exercising sufficient supervisory functions requires significant efforts by individual members. Further, adjusting the direction of an interest group requires coordination with a large number of other members. Unless dramatic issues are at stake, members may not invest the resources to assert and leverage their influence. In the absence of shocking conditions, they may therefore relegate themselves to funding organizations and granting legitimacy to the advocated interests by their number. This detachment may provide management with extensive unchecked power. Elected supervisory positions may be attractive to individuals who are interested in similar objectives as operational management, or they may be staffed under the influence of management. If there is no will or ability by members to keep management accountable to and guided by members, it may have the opportunity to shape the group's organization according to its design. That opportunity invites competitive forces to infiltrate management of an interest group. Such forces may try to obtain control by assisting with a group's regular purposes. Their investment of effort compared to regular members may facilitate their ascent in the organization. An interest group that is usurped may maintain a facade of serving its declared purposes. But the forces that have taken control of it may utilize it as means to serve undeclared purposes as well. Even if such a takeover might be apparent, members might be strongly motivated not to intervene. They may fear to lose the representation of their interests. Opposition might appear to them as disloyalty to a tribal group, or they might fear that it might be interpreted by other members that way. The chronic adversity of interest groups may prompt members to instinctively fall in line behind management despite criticisms. Hence, even if the original intent in establishing a group and appointing management might have been to maintain the membership as highest authority, this superiority might not prevail. Hierarchic instincts in management, and in members may induce the agency relationship to reverse. These factors may turn an interest group into an organization with striking similarity to a classic competitive tribe that is in the firm grip of its leadership. The competitive problem that interest groups pose is additionally aggravated by the prominent function they are allowed or encouraged to assume in purportedly cooperative conditions. Interest groups may have reserved or may have been accorded certain rights of participation in a cooperative system. Even where such official acknowledgements are missing, they might find consideration. This permissiveness toward interest groups might represent an effort to appease and integrate their competitive potentials to render them less threatening to a cooperative system. A cooperative system might endure or even solicit their participation to keep them from fighting uncontrolled competitive campaigns on or in the cooperative system. It might try to render them supporters of the cooperative system by including them as a part of the cooperative decision process. Further, organizing diverging societal interests into groups might appear to carry out an important institutional function in achieving collective reconciliation. In larger societies, it might appear practical to have positions held by a number of members embodied by representatives that speak and act for such interests and to delegate such representatives to establish and maintain arrangements with representatives of other interests on behalf of their constituents. The ensuing recognition as cooperative participants provides interest groups and their management with a semblance of legitimacy in a cooperative society. It endorses the notion that they are the legitimate representatives of their individual members' interests at the governmental level. By such provisions, however, a cooperative system, may grant an opening that allows competitive interests to rule under the pretense of cooperative participation. Regardless of whether interest groups have been appropriated by other competitive forces or represent their members, they are likely to be intent on using their participation in cooperative governance for their particular objectives and not for an overall enhancement of happiness in a society. Their particularized dedication makes them antagonists to that societal objective. Their sole purpose and care is to secure advantages for their mission. Disqualifying interest groups from societal discourse is difficult because the representation of interests in a cooperative society seems to some extent required for becoming aware of divergent positions, to enable meaningful negotiations among these, and to accomplish harmonized solutions at a societal level. During that process, discerning whether a participant's approach is cooperative or competitive might be difficult because differing positions attempt to impose their preferences on a solution. The competitive features of interest groups come to bear when they use that process to only advance their position and do not contribute to a reconciled solution that is acceptable to all participants. We may wonder why the result of a societal contest among interest groups should be so different from the contest of needs within one person. After all, interests contend with one another in a similar fashion in an individual's mind. In either case, interests may not react to the pain they cause to other interests unless such interests are well represented and pose a counterforce that must be addressed, or unless the success of interests is inherently imperiled by damaging other interests. The organizational aptitude, resources, and ruthlessness of interests may differ, and they may not focus on the value of their contributions to an optimized commonwealth. Still, arguably, the combined opinions and pressures by interest groups should create a considered balance. If debates and mutual considerations by interest groups are included into a cooperative council, they should arrive at an arrangement similar to needs within an individual's council of traits. Part of the reason this does not happen seems to be that, unlike the needs or wishes they represent, interest groups are not regulated by a pain-pleasure mechanism. Without guidance by their members, they pursue their objectives without any mechanism that would signal the strength of a related need, or when their objectives have been accomplished, to an extent that satisfies the underlying needs. They also lack the direction by an emotional and rational mechanism that would reconcile them in accordance with awareness of their satisfaction state and the mutual assessment of their importance for a societal entirety. Although they might manage to rationally grasp that the fulfillment of other interests is necessary, their myopic outlook may leave the representation of these interests to other groups. Further, their emotional detachment from the importance of their own and other interests may cause difficulties for them to correctly judge the importance of other interests relative to one another and to their interests. Reconciliation may additionally suffer because interest groups are not constrained in the same way as needs in an individual to support and protect one another in the interest of the organism that sustains them. The ability of individuals and even more groups to survive and thrive in spite of impositions on others provides them with latitude to behave irresponsibly. These differences in the nature and functioning of interest groups may disqualify them from being able to participate constructively in a cooperative discourse. They may therefore fail their members to pursue needs consistent with the priorities of members' councils of traits. Societal decision-making led by interest groups is dominated by topics that are less representative of needs and wishes in a society than their presence implies. Such a distortion makes it improbable that they can arrive at constructive terms even if they decide to compromise. Arguably, the dangers of interest representation should be narrowed by their restricted nature. In many cases, their specialization or tribalization might cause none of them to matter greatly in the overall scheme of a society or in the contest among societies. But that is not necessarily so. Conceivably, even small groups can manage to autonomously rise to controlling power over a large number of unconnected individuals or other groups. They might leverage technological or other advantages in capacity that allow them to overwhelm others. They might further sequence and pace their battles in manners that permit them to gain strength and not take on too many adversaries at a time. Even where such approaches are not available, Small interest groups may rise to controlling power. Rather than representing their separate interests openly, they may strive to avoid suspicion and adversity from other competitive interests or cooperative defenses by pursuing their goals surreptitiously. They might not only superficially act in protection and support of other competitive or cooperative powers but concentrate on becoming vital for these. This may give them the ability to shape relevant functions in their favor and may permit them to attain resources and domination. Yet, if they or their members would be recognizable as having separate interests, such a concentrated presence may expose them to a backlash in which interests they venture to control or from which they try to profit might turn against them or their members. To avoid that risk, their members might dissemble to have only casual ties, to pursue only inoffensive objectives, and to become more like their victims. Their members might disperse and attempt to merge into the competitive or cooperative groups they venture to utilize. Through such pretenses and insertions, members might be able to obtain positioning that allows them to influence matters with much greater effectiveness and efficiency. Members might further strengthen and widen their hold by assisting one another in taking and keeping key positions under defensible criteria, and by utilizing organizations they influence or control in contexts that advance their goals. Usurping interest groups may be satisfied taking advantage of forces that can attain and thus provide them with a stable, prosperous existence. However, they may also apply the groups they commandeer to expand their capacity within and beyond a society. Interest groups may undertake several parallel strategies to gain influence or control, possibly over powers that might contend with or be pitted against one another or whose operations might be associated. The competitive or cooperative use of groups they influence or control may help them to draw increased benefits from these or other affected parties, to hedge their position by controlling multiple relevant organizations contending for power, and to steer that contest. The resulting possibilities for competitive control and enrichment in approximate, or complete anonymity and security may place interest groups into an ideal position. They only have to fear the publication of their plot. They may therefore employ secrecy and, to the extent their deportment might betray them, diffusion. They may hide in organizations, philosophies, and activities that are considered legitimate and harmless by others. Beyond that, they might adopt a policy by which members operate largely autonomously, thus allowing the plausible denial of coordinated effort. In the rise of interest groups to dominance, independent methods might be supplemented by entering into clandestine or open alliances with other interest groups. These might not only be established against other interests groups. Although interest groups might battle one another to some extent, they may also conspire by tacit or express arrangements to share joint domination and rewards even if they fight over preferences and attributions and even if they would exclude, exploit, or eliminate one another if the opportunity were to arise. They may covenant to create and maintain structures and processes in their battles that guarantee them certain benefits in spite of their struggles. More than that, they might agree to modes that assist them in together dominating a competitive or cooperative setting. They may form a competitive ruling caste. Such collusion, possibly even among directly opposing interest groups, to back one another in their combined domination of government may stabilize them and their competitive rule. It may render them largely impervious to counter-movements by rivals or victims even if such efforts should be free to associate and pursue their interests as groups. They may be particularly safe from non-competitive interests because these may lack the organizational discipline and the single-minded determination of interest groups with dedicated management. Once the arrangement of interest groups has settled into governance, dislodging their rule may be extremely difficult. The great danger of falling prey to interest groups makes it obligatory for cooperative interests to battle their competitive activities. They might undertake that by informing members of a society about the dangers of competitive orientation of interest groups, insisting on their transparency, and organizing defensive efforts, including, where possible, interdiction. Cooperative interests might also emphasize the homogeneity of their society. That might turn that society into an interest group on a higher level and might only defer competitive problems and make them more potent. Avoiding this result will require a society to control its exterior behavior. Yet, before a society can pacify its exterior behavior, it must pacify itself in its interior affairs. To achieve such internal pacification, it seems useful to understand what causes the formation of interest groups. The congregation of individuals to pursue their interests as a group may have purely offensive competitive motives. But they may also join for legitimate reasons. Joint enterprises to produce goods or services fall into that category. Further, members may want to preserve independence regarding matters they wish to organize to their liking. They may try to improve the effectiveness or efficiency of their undertakings. They may venture to make their interests heard and considered in an effort to arrive at a balanced negotiated settlement with other cooperative participants in a commonwealth. Hence, some types of interest groups may appear to be helpful for a cooperative system. They may seem particularly helpful for the establishment of cooperation beyond the barriers of traditional tribal boundaries. Their variabilities of association in relation to interests seem to break up traditional tribal sensitivities that give rise to competitive insolences. Technological and economic developments do not only give reasons to associate in line with new interests. They also allow an organization of interest groups independent of the more constricting traditional criteria for association. Personal acquaintance, family ties, ethnicity, territorial integration, cultural background, and social status are becoming less defining of group memberships. Individuals obtain means they desire and reasons to enter communities in disregard of such limitations. Their interests become increasingly represented in a diversity of subject-specific relations rather than a comprehensive organizational structure. These relationships may assist to expand positive tribal concepts past traditional boundaries. They may enable individuals to rationalize their tribal instinct to where it can no longer derail or be abused for traditional tribal competition. Such a development may not solely be contrary to the intent of competitors who wish to take or maintain control of a system for their purposes. While cooperative systems may welcome a diversification of interests to overcome traditional tribal subdivisions, they may be concerned that particular combinations within and outside their boundaries might deteriorate their coherence. However, cooperative societies can significantly profit from such interests. The specialization and dispersion of such interests may make their organization helpful or necessary to develop members' faculties and contributions to their society or to avail them a presence in a societal discourse commensurate with their designs and capacities. Even if transboundary cooperation occurs in traditional areas of cooperation, a cooperative system should not be concerned about it if that advances its mission to assist the pursuits of its members and it is not used by members for competitive purposes. To prevent constructive societal suborganizations from turning competitive, a cooperative system has to challenge offensive competitive acts outright while allowing the joint pursuit of interests for constructive purposes. A cooperative society may encourage the free association of members for such purposes and may take measures to curb competitive mistakes of such enterprises. Arguably, the application of competitive measures for strictly defensive objectives constitutes a legitimate reason for organizing into interest groups as well. Such a defensive stance might not be justified. Yet, even if it is justified, it might radicalize groups to turn offensively competitive. Beyond that, a cooperative society must prevent self-help whenever the society can step in to sufficiently defend legitimate interests because exercising it pushes a cooperative society closer toward a decline into competitive combat. To curb actually and supposedly defensive competition and escalation among interest groups or between them, and a cooperative structure, a society has to provide structures and procedures that render the seeking of refuge in interest groups for defensive objectives superfluous. It must create resolution mechanisms that permit legitimate concerns of interest groups to reach attention and accommodation. Most ideally, a society may empower members to influence decisions in the society's governance directly, thus rendering the interjection of interest groups moot. Moreover, it may liberally enable dissociation and organization in arrangements within a society that facilitate individuals to organize according to particular preferences within a society. It may restrict itself to administrating affairs that must be handled at a higher level. Competitive interests may energetically campaign against these concepts because they deprive them of their power. They may attempt to make victims believe that direct determination and governance by individuals are neither effective nor efficient, and will lead to competitive chaos. They may urge the necessity of a central authority to maintain order. They may suggest that a professional authority is necessary to competently manage the affairs of a cooperative society and its factions, and that a cooperative society has to delegate power to such an authority. Such delegation allows competitors to interject themselves as managers of delegated functions and to assume power by reversing the positions between them and their victims. Citing the apparent legitimacy and the utility of delegation, competitive interests may try to cover their designs. Even if a separate governance structure is not the result of competitive calculations, it might be the result of condescension and elitism by founders or supporters of a cooperative system. Either way, they may argue that tasks of such importance and complexity should be left to persons with sufficient resources to dedicate time to government affairs, or who are particularly skilled and educated or otherwise better prepared to oversee societal affairs. Members of a society might reflect this attitude on their own motion even if they have cooperative intent. They might independently resolve to delegate governmental functions. They might be motivated by hierarchic instincts to rally behind leaders. Members might reject non-hierarchic forms of organization for seemingly rationally sound reasons. Tasks of government might appear more difficult for them or other members than for qualified elites. They might not be willing or might not regard themselves able to invest the necessary effort to organize and administrate the larger circumstances of their existence. They might shy away from taking responsibility for more than their immediate pursuits and from the scrutiny and accountability associated with public office. Tradition and the lack of insight how their affairs could be organized in departure from traditional forms of government might influence or prevent their considerations. Reconciling the variety of views with one another on their own might seem impossible or too difficult. They might not trust that they or similar individuals possess the mental aptitude, maturity, or education to govern effectively and efficiently. However, more than by any other concerns, they might be impressed by a concern that order will collapse if they all have equal say and the power to veto decisions that are in the overall interest. Their fear of unknown cooperative form of governance, of resulting chaos, and ultimately of one another might arouse their hierarchic instinct. Consequently, the members of a society might approve to largely cede governmental power to a separate entity. They might acknowledge the authority of that government because it is derived from their voluntary cessation of power as the governed. This offers ideal entry points for competitive interests to assume control of their governmental system. Competitors might supplement members' motivations through manipulation or coercion. Yet, even without such interference, members' motivations to create a separate authority over them, and to submit to that authority might be overwhelming and automatic. Where competitive forces do not exist that could assume power, cooperative interests might create the structures and processes that induce them. Cooperative forces might knowingly support the formation of forces with competitive capabilities and hand control to them, although they might intend competitive strategies only to be used for the benefit of the Commonwealth. We might criticize such attitudes as evidence of instinctive vestiges, lethargy, ignorance, naivety, overwrought fears, or a lack of self-confidence of members in cooperative societies. However, even if we discount all of these causes, sufficient rational reasons seem to remain that by themselves seem to warrant and even require the organization of governance in a hierarchic fashion. The concept of an ordered society appears to imply the submission of its members to rules and their enforcement. While members of a cooperative society might agree on fundamental laws, the articulation and the enforcement of these laws through the creation of more particular rules and their application to circumstances may activate disagreement. If individual pursuits are at stake, acknowledgements of fundamental laws may waver even if non-competitive pursuits are available, and the principal advantages of cooperation are understood. Individuals may vacillate in complying with imperatives that they subordinate their immediate concerns to long-term benefits and that they advance satisfaction of their needs cooperatively in the face of competitive opportunities that seem to benefit their interests more. Even if they formally agreed to such imperatives, conforming with these may require levels of consideration, discipline, and skill that may exceed their rational and emotional aptitude. The drive for happiness, if not fully developed and defined, and if not controlled by a mature council of traits, is a ravenous, impetuous force that cares little about ramifications that are not palpable or clearly foreseeable with certainty. It wants to live in the present, and is propelled by current impressions of needs and immediate cures. It is prone to ignore or to underestimate the broader context of happiness, and the later repercussions of actions. It may continually tempt us to abandon our commitments or to at least permit occasional exceptions to them. As needs that would profit from such departures strengthen, the attitude of principally cooperatively minded individuals might not remain consistently cooperative. Even if we have fully reconciled our needs within ourselves and thus fully support collective reconciliation as an individual desire, our council of traits may not be able to withstand the urging of needs whose deprivation makes them increasingly powerful. Unless needs are being regularly satisfied, a rise in deprivation may easily lead to competitive deterioration of our attitude due to a reassessment by our council of traits. If our council of traits is not fully formed or is weakened by deprivation, the initiation of offensive competitive acts by others may give rise to similar offensive competitive violations by us under the guise of a defensive stance. Particularly if we agree to covenants of collective reconciliation as a measure of utility and not as a matter of individual desire, we may take the breach of its non-offensive covenant by others as justification to give in to the urgings by some of our traits. We may terminate that covenant or the entire agreement so that we can pursue needs without consideration of others. Hence, an imperfect cooperative system may soon unravel. To protect comprehensive and long-term concerns of happiness from being corrupted by narrowly focused and immediate impulses, a cooperative system will have to impose limitations on the activities of its members, including their defensive behavior. To encourage actions that are compatible with a cooperative idea of happiness, it has to impose boundaries and preserve these boundaries by rendering competitive acts impossible or at least ineffective. To reach up to its potential, it has to be able to prevent, discourage, punish, and repair the effects of competitive behavior. To exert that power, a cooperatively inclined society must contain a general hierarchy between government and the governed. Even governance by all the members of a society implies a hierarchy. The imposition of boundaries and their enforcement is unlikely to be left to extemporaneous decisions by a community. Members will prefer the security of rules. If they approve to be governed by rules, they become legitimately subjected to them. Beyond these general requirements to safeguard the stability of cooperative society, an additional hierarchic subordination may appear to be unavoidable as a practical matter. Members may only agree to a limited range of rules that may require extensive detailing and supplementation in the complex contexts of a society. They may be unwilling to dedicate the effort to create such laws or may not be able to agree on them. Further, the administration of laws may require extensive or specialized resources. Members may not individually possess the necessary resources or may not be willing to make them available. Apart from such resource considerations, the administration of laws by members might give rise to competitive escalation and hence be counterproductive. Involving independent functionaries for governmental affairs therefore appears to be warranted even for administrating cooperative concerns. This presents a problem because a separate government implies structures and processes that inherently gravitate toward competitive abuse. Even in a representative system that was founded on the idea of the supremacy and consent of the governed and that requires periodic election of governing personnel, hierarchic government has a tendency of becoming its own purpose and defining its own program. The institutionalization of government separate from the governed fashions an association of functionaries and a distance between this association and governed subjects that may already introduce negative tribal motivations. Moreover, the intrinsically unequal relationship between the governing and governed group incites hierarchic competitive impulses in members of the governing group, based on their deemed superiority. These motivations may cause government to act against the functionalities with which it was originally entrusted, and to replace them with its own competitive agenda. As a consequence, a segregated government may offensively assert itself against the populace. This motivation is particularly strong because it must surmount implications of being a cooperative derivative. To attain and maintain a position commensurate with its ambitions, it must reverse its intended cooperative agency at the discretion of the governed and the implied hierarchy. The competitive stance of separate government is likely to become apparent, as it resists being held to agreed concepts of a cooperatively oriented society that placed it in power. It may interpret legitimate demands by constituents for its non-involvement, its assistance, the limitation of its power, or its change, or endeavors to monitor and control its functions, hold it accountable, and hold its functionaries liable for competitive practices as competitive disturbances and threats to its mechanisms, supremacy, and independence. It may consider the populace to be a potential threat that might rival governmental power unless it is contained. It might encounter the governed with fear and suspicion because they retain the claim of supremacy and the factual potential to change and defeat government. Government may develop a purportedly defensive stance to safeguard itself against that threat to its existence and power, which results in competitive assertion against those it is charged to protect and advance. It may become increasingly non-responsive to their plight and hostile to their attempts to improve their fate through or against government. It may regard its subjects as unwieldy and obstinate, as impediments or opponents in the planning and execution of its policies. That situation becomes additionally aggravated because it has to rely on its subjects for resources. The governed are likely to voluntarily provide government with the resources necessary to fulfill its originally entrusted functions. However, that is likely to change as government exceeds these boundaries. As government assumes more intense control of matters that were already under governmental administration, inserts itself into matters that were originally excluded from governmental functions, and transforms governmental functions into self-serving undertakings, its deviation from popular intent, and its claim on resources increase. As the populace resists such expansions and conversions of functions and resists providing resources for them, government becomes a competitive force that subjects members to its will and compels them to part with resources. Government attitudes may harden to view the populace as a nuisance and potential threat that must be controlled and a resource that must be exploited to enable, strengthen, and advance government. Its deviation from the approved scope of activities requires it to resort to devices for alignment that surmount the opposition of the governed. Competitive activities by a separate government are enabled by entrusting government with competitive capabilities to defend against domestic and foreign competitive threats or to conduct offensive operations outside the system. It seems legitimate that this power is not only exercised to protect the populace against competitive overreaching but also to protect the government so it can fulfill its functions. A segregated government may herald that justification in its use of competitive tools although it has betrayed its function to serve the public. By claiming identity of its interests with the interests of the governed, defensive measures taken by subjects against the government may be labeled as offensive acts against the represented commonwealth. Government may interpret resistance or mere recalcitrance to support its agenda as offensive competitive activities. It may mobilize its purportedly defensive competitive competencies to neutralize that opposition. Such government may still officially claim service to the population as its sole motivation and invent various contortions to justify its competitive actions. Even so, such declarations may be ultimately ineffective to overcome popular resistance that is based on a concept of limited government. Its ostentatious contradiction of that concept and its inherently separated and persistently expansive organizational nature may not permit such competitive government to settle into more subtle, manipulatory modes of competitive rule other competitors might prefer. At best, it might achieve a resentful stalemate that is solely upheld by its comprehensive hold on rules and their implementation. Arguably, such attitudes and consequences might be preempted or curtailed by making the tenure of government personnel temporary and by circulating individuals from the general populace through government positions. However, for practical reasons, it may not seem feasible to recall and substitute the entirety of government personnel in time to prevent institutionalized competitive attitudes. For the sake of effectiveness, efficiency, and continuity of governmental functions, many of its positions may have to continue. Hence, only those that do not require detailed functionality may be designated to be temporary. Yet even officials who are subjected to term limits or the power of the governed to select and recall may reign for years. More than that, after their time in office ceases, they may continue to be involved in an organization that retains or endeavors to regain power. Due to such organizations, governance may be reduced to few parties with changing figureheads. Compared to such professional organizations for obtaining and retaining power, the governed may represent a comparatively disorganized blend and their awareness of governmental affairs tends to be scarce. They may accept these professional organizations as their only available mediators for controlling their government. As a consequence, representative government tends to possess relative continuity and stability and tends to remain fundamentally undisturbed by the governed. Provided with their own domain, government functionaries become rulers as well as servants of an independent machination, that includes the political parties placing these functionaries. Government may be temporarily bound to different parties as they rise to and fade from power. But there is likely to be an understanding among parties that do or might circulate in and out of power to preserve the settings that allow their governance and return. The limited movement of control among parties and lasting governmental structures and processes on which they can depend in their governance create a governmental caste that, even with accessions from the governed, remains stable. Besides institutional competitive deterioration, a separate government favors the development of competitive attitudes in individuals or groups that are entrusted with managing it. Once they assume institutional powers, they are elevated in their capabilities of creating and of enforcing rules or rulings over the status of regular members in the system. This may permit them to act against their mandate, and to abuse their power. Representative cooperative systems may attempt to take precautions and require assurances that those entrusted to govern maintain the trust invested in them. Still, individuals and groups in hierarchic power may not want or be able to suppress their competitive tendencies. They may cherish the power, privileges, and competitive opportunities that their positions entail. They might justify their persistence in pursuing and holding on to them as an attempt to serve the public and prevent less competent administration by others. They might also have motivations that are not competitive in their immediate intent. They might seek respect and enjoy protecting, supporting, or constructively shaping their surroundings. They might fear a lack of purpose or of means once they leave office. Nevertheless, such motivations induce governing persons or groups hold on to their power and necessarily prompt competitive strategies. Their positions afford them with superior opportunities to act upon their competitive urges while affording them with extensive impunity. They may be justified in expecting to be generally shielded from accountability to the public because of the imbalance of power in their favor. Official and unofficial government secrecy may not allow the governed familiarity with competitive practices. At most, they might be able to insist on compliance with formalities of laws designed to provide insight into governmental processes. But their separation from government curbs their ability to effect the substantive functioning of disclosure mechanisms. To provide incentives that government officials would call upon one another to account, a representative cooperative system might be devised in ways to create checks and balances. Such mechanisms may in some respects be established by attributing different principal government functions to different branches. In addition, functions of one type may be divided into the work of separate institutions that have to collaborate or exercise monitoring functions. However, trust in these mechanisms to uncover competitive misconduct in other institutions might be misplaced. Competitive forces in government recognize and fear the detrimental potential that checks and balances pose for their practices. They may therefore unite to occupy the pertaining offices. Even if they are divided, they may understand that their own conduct may be denounced and investigated if they lay open abusive practices by other officials. This incentivizes them to come to an understanding whereby they tolerate one another's taking advantage of their offices. Officials who remain true to public service or who might deem it possible to obtain an advantage by exposing competitive behavior by other officials might be broadly met with opposition by an alliance of such competitive powers. Troublemakers might be discredited and removed before they have an opportunity to damage the governing establishment or soon after they have uncovered competitive practices. Even where that is not the case, the exposure of misconduct may negatively affect powers that might support them or larger contexts that enable their career. Considering such threats, government functionaries who do not directly engage in competitive abuse may be persuaded to support or to tolerate competitive government activities. They may form an implicit cartel with those who abuse government based on a common interest to continue in their positions. Some control may be applicable to the extent government officials exercise their obligations undauntedly, and do not care about consequences for their interests or are unwilling to pass up opportunities to damage their opponents that challenge them for government positions or resources. However, such tendencies may be uncommon considering the discipline imposed by parties, and the understanding among them not to jeopardize the setting from which they profit. Some restraint among officials may prevail because publicity endangers those who know of abuse and do not counteract it. Concern about being publicly branded as protectors or co-conspirators of competitive abuse may move government officials to deny cover to one another. Yet, even if corrective forces succeed at the time, this will not enduringly correct such a system. The punishment, replacement, and containment of officials who disappoint cooperative trust do not solve the underlying problem arising from separate rule. Delegating our participation in governing our affairs to others necessarily provides a vacuum that is likely to be filled by competitive interests. The belief in a representative system, in which the governed place certain groups or individuals in charge, is founded on a fallacy. It assumes or hopes that those aspiring or those selected to govern will dedicate themselves to a selfless service to which the governed are not willing or able to commit. The governed entrust control to individuals and groups who may not be any more resistant to competitive lapses than the governed, and possibly less if they seek positions of governance. In addition, the governed may do their part to enable these lapses in those they entrust with governing. The immediate needs and related competitive instincts of governed individuals and groups entice them to impress on government to abstain from interfering with their particular pursuits or to use its superior power for the advancement of their particular purposes. Such influence by governed individuals and groups may be particularly successful where it can combine with the competitive impulses of governing forces. It may leverage the aspirations of individuals and parties to obtain or maintain power and their penchant to competitively employ this power by offering an exchange of favors. Support by non-governmental competitive forces entrenches government and its abuses, while the protection and support of such interests by government provides backing and opportunities for their competitive activities. Initiated by either side, the complementarity of ambitions and resulting symbiosis between competitive forces in and outside government may generate a joint, interdependent ruling class. The consolidation of power allows competitive interests to take wide-ranging advantage of a representative cooperative system, and its economic basis. Resources will have to be shared within the merged class. But the merged interests would have competed for the same resources, and the mutual advantages increase their takings and security. Such a scheme seems to become inevitably established through the manner in which governing individuals and parties are selected for service in a representative cooperative system. The participation of the governed in a segregated government is limited to the appointment of delegates or appointees. These government positions are usually filled as the result of a contest. That custom appears to be a remnant of the instinctive manner in which the leaders of human societies have historically been determined. It may be upheld by the competitive nature of those who seek government positions, by competitive interests that try to secure influence, and even by cooperative interests that seek to qualify the best candidates. The contestants for the offices of delegates then engage in competitive strategies to obtain and retain their office. Those in government or who wish to govern would have to be predisposed to make use of competitive strategies or would have to become committed competitors to succeed. To possess a chance of winning in a competition for governance, contending individuals and parties may need resources beyond their own. This requirement for resources constitutes an ideal occasion for governed competitive interests that seek to influence government. They may selectively assist candidates for office to attain and hold positions with their funds and strategic support or use their resources to damage or destroy them. Even more directly, competitive interests may present their own representatives for office. Political parties may mediate and mitigate this activity somewhat. The competitive nature and patronage of a contest for office place individuals and parties that seek to obtain or maintain government positions and are not already being backed by competitive governed interests in a dependent relationship with sponsoring competitive interests. Their assistance creates an understanding that this sponsorship must be justified and compensated by a favorable direction of government. In spite of having to display competitive prowess to win, competitive interests might not be able to flaunt their true competitive intent if they desire to win. Their competitive focus may not be broadly shared by the electorate because they are planning to exploit or exclude at least portions of that electorate. They are therefore likely to hide behind manipulations and misrepresentations aimed at preventing a detection of their actual intent and practices and providing them with popular assistance. They may obtain popular acclaim by clothing themselves in popular competitive and cooperative points of view and becoming their advocates. This may add to their deceiving appeal and create a broader basis of power while at the same time providing them cover. They might establish or otherwise dominate a variety of groups that represent these popular interests. They might merge or otherwise assemble these interest groups into larger political alliances to support and to influence political parties that compete for office or to become such parties. Competitive interest groups might also join into alliances and parties without being ruled by other competitive interests. If popular points of view are not represented, such associations of interests may adopt representational or at least compatible positions. Competitive interests may then acquire or conceive of assorted objectives with sufficiently broad appeal to win majorities for governmental power. To motivate followers, such interests may promise explicit compensation by offices or favoring. Yet, to reserve sufficient resources for themselves and safeguard their superior standing, such remunerations may have to be limited. To still obtain and retain the necessary following and societal control, competitive interests may apply manipulatory techniques incorporating indoctrination, misinformation, and miseducation. But their most powerful manipulatory tool seems to be the use of existing or of available emotions in the population. They might evoke, foster, or take advantage of indignation, jealousy, greed, pride, patriotism, hate, fear, and attempts to compensate for self-doubt, particularly to the extent they are expressions of or relate to tribal and hierarchic instincts. They may appeal to conditions of threat or opportunity that cause members to fall in line and rally behind their leadership that they strive to profile as necessary or helpful. They may create or amplify perilous conditions or place voters in apprehension of such conditions. They may depict opportunities for competitive advantages, and express them in terms that make them justifiable and appealing in members' appraisal. They may distinguish cooperative interests, competitive rivals, or other individuals or groups within or beyond the system as potentially or actually damaging or as unworthy. They may use imagined or actual differences in specific attitude, conduct, or appearance, or more general cultural, religious, geographic, ethnic, social, economic, or other genetic or environmental discrepancies in support of such arguments. Such manipulations may not only benefit candidates but also assist political parties that profile themselves to be supportive and protective tribal units for their members and for voters. The emotional charges such manipulations impart may overshadow and offset members' and voters' concerns and heighten their commitment. Individuals in a representative cooperative system may then be co-opted as competitive supporters without their awareness or appreciation of that transformation, or they might at least be swayed not to object to and not to interfere in competitive practices. Emotional manipulation may not only rally victims to afford competitive assistance but also divert them from being competitively mistreated and redirect their emotional reaction. It may further bind rivals into a conciliatory attitude for fear of being exposed to public wrath. Opponents who are targeted by competitors' activities and invectives may be preoccupied with defending, and have less capacity to address the broader competitive abuse perpetrated by their attackers or their affiliates. Even if they uncover misdeeds and potential for harm and set forth suggestions of better alternatives, their voices may be drowned out by emotional preemption of attacks directed against them as well as the general arsenal of manipulation available to competitors. By damaging or containing adversaries and by governing supporters and ultimate victims' minds, competitive interests may dominate a society sufficiently to obtain the freedom to conduct their business surreptitiously or even openly. In a system in which majorities rule, the threshold for competitive interests to become rulers is relatively low. They only have to pose choices in recurring intervals that are more electable than others, and they are by convention permitted to rule over parts of the population that voted for candidates or parties with less votes and members that abstained from voting. Hence, the elective process in a cooperatively oriented society allows them to take command with less risk and cost than any other method. They may succeed in dominating the government in a representative cooperative society even if extensive numbers of its members cannot be manipulated. As a consequence of competitive machinations and the incomplete and diverging state of individual and collective reconciliation of which these machinations take advantage, cooperative forces are likely to be less united, organized, and strident. This may make their realization of stable majorities difficult. To consolidate their influence and control in addition, competitive interests that desire to rule may influence or govern, and even establish, relevant parties that compete for majority control. They may allow and conduct dynamics that give semblances that the selection of one or the other party will provide effective representation of subjects' concerns. A controlled political contest may build the impression that modifying the system for the better may be possible. These pretenses may subsequently be conveniently deferred, diluted, and frustrated regardless of what party or parties obtain popular confidence in an election. Election promises may be habitually broken. Parties may be able to blame one another for the immovability of issues in such a system to obscure the actual causes for non-action. The system may be shaped and maintained in a way to make such an impasse possible. The influence by competitive interests may position subjects in a representative cooperative system without any proper choice to have their interests represented in government. But maintaining a government with total unresponsiveness to popular demands might be too perilous. It might lay bare the manipulated nature of the system too brazenly and might prompt subjects to question the justification for the burdens that government exacts on them. Competitive rulers may therefore maintain a semblance of functioning representation. Partial sensitivity to the issues of their victims and assistance to them may successfully create an illusion of a functional political system in which victims' interests are represented and keeps their dissatisfaction below critical levels. The authority of government, the entrenchment of competitive powers in it with the ambition and means to use its powers, and their skilled use of manipulation may render ruling competitive forces difficult to dislodge. But the task is particularly difficult because the institutionalization of government generates a perfect setting for competitive interests to hide. The separate, arcane, and secretive character of government processes, and their facility to form circumstances under ostensibly legitimate pretenses or the usage of general phrasing make governmental endeavors on behalf of competitive interests often hard to detect. That difficulty is increased because the competitive interests in charge may extensively clothe themselves with the mantle of cooperation. Beyond retaining cooperative economic mechanisms for production reasons, competitive interests may permit, and assist cooperative demeanor in other areas as well. The organizational advantages of cooperation may assist them in influencing a society as a cooperative tribal entirety without discernible instigation. They may further keep cooperative institutions and mechanisms sufficiently alive and active so that they can pursue their competitive objectives safe from detection or repercussions in their shadow. Competitive interests may also integrate themselves into purportedly cooperative functions and conduct their activities rather openly under false justifications. They may use many if not all of the institutions created for cooperative purposes as instruments to undertake their business with ostensible legitimacy. Where necessary, they may cause cooperative bodies to delegate tasks that necessitate more secrecy or competitive guidance to institutions that these bodies create and legitimize but over which they only possess or wield restricted or no power. Moreover, only a small portion of the undertakings of competitive interests or only their sum or interlocking effects may represent activities that would be recognizable as competitive. Ruling competitive interests may be able to confine their activities because their interests may only require limited resources or merely require the domination of some matters. They may permit the conduct of large segments of a cooperative system mostly undisturbed once they have set and control its legal framework. To the extent they practice competition, such rulers may prefer to conduct remote direction by exerting deniable influence on candidates and on parties that gives these the appearance of independence. For competitive acts that might not be safely undertaken by government, ruling interests might use other surrogates whose actions would be difficult to trace to their direction. These measures may enable competitive rulers to maintain power and competitive practices in relative anonymity and stability. The ability of competitive rulers to disguise their activities and presence constitutes a great advantage for establishing and maintaining their rule in a representative cooperative system. Notwithstanding, their reluctance to present themselves fully and openly demonstrates a weakness. That competitive interests operate under a mantle of secrecy and collusion shows that they consider themselves, and may be in fact, not robust enough to govern outright if that secrecy were to be lifted. Revealing the presence and activity of competitive interests and the consequences of their abuse might raise the opposition of individuals who might otherwise remain indifferent and unclear in their cooperative awareness. Still, such a disclosure can only succeed if it finds the populace receptive. Because competitive interests may understand their vulnerability to popular awareness, they might be determined to suppress efforts to raise that awareness. Then again, they might deem their position to be sufficiently secure to largely ignore discrediting efforts. Remote strategies and secrecy may make disclosure of their rule difficult. Further, they might be assured by their cooperative concessions that permit the acceptable satisfaction of many needs and their capability to manipulate members into believing their needs to be fulfilled. Where that fails, they may find stability in targeting scapegoats for non-fulfillment or in otherwise distracting subjects as well as in exerting official and societal pressure on individuals or groups that dissent. Such measures may keep most members supportive, lethargic, or reluctant to fight competitive impositions by their government even if these are evident. They may permit information that exposes them in general terms to be freely available because they can rest assured that only marginal segments of the population will seek such information. They may have confidence that bringing such disclosure to the awareness of wider spans of the population will not prompt most victims to take defensive action. Even if members gain awareness of their reconciled needs and begin to comprehend that these are being obstructed by ruling competitive interests, The uncovering of general competitive strategies by and under the cover of government may be too abstract and seemingly removed from recourse. They may consider themselves helpless against this systemic betrayal. Violations might have to rise to a level of pain or fear that members regard as intolerable. Even then, they might be reluctant to take decisive action unless discontent galvanizes a sufficient number of members to set forth a credible opposition with a chance to take on seemingly dauntingly powerful foes. Alternatively, a competitively dominated system would have to be exposed to be weak enough to increase the chances of success. That may happen when flagrant abuse surfaces that exceeds normal levels. Proving specific acts of competitive abuse connected to specific individuals or institutions may also alert regularly oblivious members. Yet, to the extent competitive activities rise to sufficient notoriety and potential for adverse reactions, competitive interests may describe them as non-typical excesses that can be controlled by the system with no or slight adjustments. Legal procedures against competitive functionaries may not be feasible because their behavior may be lawful, they may be pardoned, or cases might simply not be prosecuted. If necessary, competitive rulers might sacrifice functionaries that might be blamed for undeniable competitive overreaching. If such sacrifices do not suffice, competitive rulers might try to appease defensive motivations by consenting to remediation. But measures under their control are bound to leave them with the bulk of their illegitimate gains. Further, apparent curative reforms may be deferred, diluted, and rescinded when attention recedes and infractions might have settled into and merged with the background of popular acceptance of a competitive environment. Only if the outrage becomes so intense and widespread that competitive rulers are in danger of incalculable opposition might they agree to full compensation or systemic measures that curtail their power. Apart from extraordinary circumstances that coerce them to retreat, competitive interests that have been identified by their own actions or through independent exposure might stand their ground and justify their notorious behavior to overcome adverse sentiments. They might declare not only that their economic and general societal activities are beneficial. They may also assert that the cooperation and functional amalgamation between government and them are part of a constructive strategy that is in the interest of the entire society. They may argue that their administration of the economic and other concerns in a society produces a maximum of overall well-being and success. They may claim identity of their and societal interests and may attempt to brand their collusion with government as an effort to coordinate subject matters in the interest of a society. Even after systematically damaging effects of their activities have become clear, they may maintain that their leadership is overall beneficial for a society, that there is no viable let alone equally or more proficient cooperative alternative, and that the well-being and the survival of the society depend on their positioning and their thriving. If competitive interests are sufficiently entrenched in their control of societal processes, and particularly of underlying economic processes, a challenge to their existence and operations may indeed threaten the system in its current form. Competitive interests may therefore attempt to hold a system hostage. Such an undertaking may be disarmed to some extent if a society has a convincing vision of a better alternative. However, even then, competitive interests may render their removal or restraint so arduous and costly for a society that they might largely succeed in preserving their position. Their power over a society might make it impossible to excise or even curtail them without comprehensive restructuring. In the face of such adversity, many subjects might opt for the accommodation of competitive rule as a lesser problem. The number of individuals holding that attitude will dramatically rise in the absence of a convincing, generally shared plan of how a society can be liberated from competitive domination or what shape of government should replace it. Together with individuals who on their own or as a result of manipulation are ambivalent about the damage and benefit of competition or who support competitive rule, a majority may gather that permits a representative cooperative system to be competitively dominated. The correlation of general competitive attitudes by government, competitive interests by individuals in office, and other competitive interests in a society may unite into a competitive triumvirate that may constitute a perfect setting for competitive interests to survive and thrive. It bestows on them comprehensive control of cooperative production at low cost and risk, thus maximizing their benefits more than any other system. Because a representative cooperative system enables competitive rulers to rule with higher effectiveness and efficiency, competitive interests can be expected to agitate in its favor. Competitive interests that rule in more obviously competitive systems may willingly transition into it. Because such a system has the appearance of being more moderate and of placing cooperative forces in charge, such forces may strive for such a change as well. After transition, cooperative interests may believe that they have gained significant advances over competitive forces, and competitive rulers may support that belief by granting cooperative interests the superficial appearance of supremacy. Even if cooperative movements try to radically break with former competitive systems and neutralize previous competitive rulers, the representative system they create in the aftermath invites, helps to establish, and defends the rule of competitive interests. By instituting a representative cooperative system, cooperative forces assist competitive forces to defeat them even after cooperative forces have already accomplished victory over authoritarian competitive rule. Competitive forces that understand the improved productivity and safety of a nominally cooperative system for their purposes may instigate, support, control, or take advantage of representative cooperative efforts to convert or to overturn an authoritarian system. The transition from authoritarian forms of competitive rule may occur by revolution or a gradual process depending on whether such insightful competitive forces emerge externally or from within the authoritarian rule. Either way, the result is a form of competitive rule that appears to be extremely resilient. Hence, the institution of a representative cooperative system may damage cooperative interests more enduringly than authoritarian domination. The association between separate governance and competitive rule makes it difficult to understand why cooperative interests would choose this path. In spite of all practical reasons that may cause them to consider separate government and the limited corporate benefits they may achieve under it, the at best disappointing performance and often disastrous consequences of this form of government should intensely militate against choosing it. Much of the reason that does not occur is to be found in the fact that societies did not begin in and never had a phase of cooperative purity. Rather, most societies have a tradition of governmental hierarchy and competition for leadership that reaches back to instinctive coordination, and has been continued even as humanity and cooperative alternatives developed. In spite of all rational reasons to the contrary that better insight might bring, strong instinctive motivations seem to remain and regularly win even in cooperatively minded individuals. These may continue to have impulses to entrust governance to an elite. This notion fundamentally contradicts the concept of cooperation. That those subjected to such a governance expressly or impliedly agreed to subject themselves to it does not change the fact that the separate organization of government subordinates these individuals to other individuals and invites abuse. Even if such risks are acknowledged and cooperative interests may strive for cooperative forms of governance, they may retain hierarchic structures and processes of governance because they are confronted with transitioning a competitive environment into its antithesis. They may consider a hierarchic organization helpful or necessary to succeed in their defensive competitive endeavors against offensively competitive elements within the system as well as beyond its boundaries that may attempt to interfere in the affairs of the system during its transitional disorder. Moreover, they may try to take measured steps to securely enable themselves as well as others to relinquish competitive strategies of securing means and to embrace cooperative practices. Even where members are ready for a transition, they may pursue a gradual departure for lack of experience. Yet a farther-reaching cooperative organization might never arrive because offensive competitive forces might assume power during such a hierarchic phase. Their rise to power may be assisted by a hesitance in members to entirely commit to a cooperative transformation. They may deem hierarchic structures and processes obligatory to deflect offensive competitive designs from abroad as long as these might exist or arise. They may further regard it necessary to indefinitely employ hierarchic institutions to protect against offensive competitive threats from within their own ranks. While they might understand the inadequacies of hierarchic manners of organization, they may not trust that cooperative values alone can build and maintain a functioning cooperative society, or that it would fully function in their best interests. Even if they believe that cooperative principles are inherently capable, they may want to reserve an authority that supervises the implementation and maintenance of such principles, at least until these are more completely rooted in members. Beyond that, cooperative interests may not want to transition hierarchic manners of organization that benefit them. Their cooperative interests may not be fully developed, and they may desire to reserve the right to employ at least some competition under governmental sanction. The tradition of separate, hierarchic government may thus maintain broad support even as members of a society embrace cooperation. In addition to such attitudes by cooperatively minded individuals, the continuing incidence of predominantly competitively minded individuals who might have to be incentivized to participate, or at least acquiesce in a cooperative society, may induce cooperative interests to find arrangements with competitive interests. Establishing an ordered and stable system that advances cooperative interests may require an attitude that does not insist on cooperative pureness and that also accommodates competitive interests. Members of a society who benefit from competitive practices may try to keep the system from becoming fully cooperative, even if they cannot prevent all cooperative developments to which they object. They might make their countenance of all participation in a system with cooperative characteristics conditional on the extension of safeguards for their interests that imply hierarchy. In exchange for the opportunity to reach their demands to a reasonable degree in a representative cooperative system, they may be moved to back such a system for the time being. But such members may easily change their mind if circumstances become available that are more amenable to their underlying competitive attitudes. Societal consideration for their concerns may not be indispensable for the ultimate installation of competitive forces as rulers, because such forces may not or not only pursue openly recognizable competitive strategies in a cooperative system. Still, competitors with ambitions to rule may spring from the pool of pacified competitors that are integrated into the cooperative system. Their ascent may be facilitated because the permission of competitive activity may provide them with means and cover. Although the settings and dynamics of representative cooperative systems overwhelmingly favor the assumption of control by competitive forces, these have to pay tribute to cooperative structures and processes to control such a system with favorable effectiveness and efficiency. This engenders a continuing systemic contradiction. A representative cooperative system provides powerful tools to manage this contradiction. But increased clarity by members about their needs and their requirements to fulfill them, and their realization that their environment does not sufficiently reflect these, prompt them to scrutinize the causes. Such inquiries may disclose much about the inquiring and other individuals and their interactions. They further must eventually lead to an awareness of inappropriate competitive impositions. Inquiring members are bound to become aware of deficiencies that the present system creates, fails to address, does not permit them to address, or tries to dissuade them from addressing. Forces that recognize such obstacles may attempt to overcome them. They may be dangerous to ruling competitive interests because they can see through the mantle of cooperative accessories with which competitive rulers cover themselves. While such individuals might not be manipulated or bribed by the tolerable or even more accommodating distribution of means and superficial cooperative liberty, they might be impressed by the potential repercussions of their opposition to ruling interests. They might consider dissociating themselves rather than trying to change the system against seemingly overwhelming odds. But the damaging effects of dissociation may prevent it from being a satisfactory choice. In addition, there may not be many other systems where dissociating individuals could be secure from competitive exclusions and predations. These may be afflicted with similar or worse ills, and any truly cooperative sanctuary may be subject to competitive interference by foreign systems because of the dangerous example it sets for cooperative rule. Victims of competitive rule may therefore decide to take a stand. An effective opposition to competitive domination may develop spontaneously or due to the spread of guidance that leads individuals to enlightenment, and the cumulative autonomous economic behavior of enlightened individuals. Where that does not seem to be sufficient to change a system, such individuals may organize to undertake concerted economic action and to become a unified political force in the representative system. While such activities may improve the permeation of cooperative attitudes, they may also raise the profile of cooperative movements and make them more practicable targets for competitive counteraction within the capabilities of competitive rulers. Competitive interests may employ a number of underhanded strategies to prevent the application of cooperative conversion strategies. But there are limits to what they can do in a representative cooperative system. The spread of cooperative recognition, autonomous or concerted economic activity, and the organization of political movements cannot be foreclosed unless competitive rulers elect to drop their disguise. Rather than suffering defeat, competitive rulers may select this sole remaining option and take coercive action. Arguably, cooperative interests that choose to counteract such coercion would have to adopt similar defensive competitive strategies to defend against the suppression of their activities and hostilities against their person. They might further adopt such strategies to defend against offensive competition that permeates the system without direct coercion. Some cooperative forces might even believe that their preemptive use of coercive strategies against competitive interests will force competitive rulers to come out of hiding, and display their competitive nature. Such forces might believe that this might alert larger parts of the population to the competitive subjection of their existence. However, any competitive struggle between competitive and cooperative forces appears to necessarily favor entrenched competitive forces. Competitive demeanor, even if it is for defensive purposes, may not come easily to cooperative interests because it represents the antithesis of their objectives. Competitive interests for which such strategies form the familiar and desired essence of their endeavors are likely to be more effective and efficient at competitive maneuvers. They are better primed to settle into an existence of ongoing competitive conflict. Determined competitive interests can compel cooperative interests to fight according to their rules. Having to resort to competitive measures to defend against offensive attempts threatens to disrupt cooperative processes. It forces cooperative interests to reorient themselves and their activities for a fight. Competitive involvement threatens to transmute cooperative interests and to render them indistinguishable from offensive competitive forces. If their struggles are involved, they risk losing their way. Societal adjustments pursuant to tribal and hierarchic instincts and practical requirements of conducting a competitive conflict may exact consequences during a conflict that may be difficult to reverse after the conflict is over. This threat provides offensive competitive forces with leverage. Cooperative interests do not possess a reciprocal leverage that would commit competitive interests to adhere to cooperative rules in a conflict. Nor are competitive interests inherently bound to cooperate with cooperative interests beyond settings of conflict. Even if the utilization of cooperative processes might significantly benefit competitive interests, they do not intrinsically depend on the maintenance of a cooperative system. Their recognition of this fundamental advantage may entice competitive powers to threaten, instigate, and maintain competitive conflict. Even in a representative cooperative situation, the potential of competitive rulers to resort to more severe competitive conduct may secure them an advantage. They may concede their existence and make the continuance of cooperative modes of activity dependent on compliance with their domination. To uphold cooperative manners of pursuit as much as possible, cooperative forces might offer substantial concessions to competitive interests and refrain from competitive defenses. Before competitive rulers are entirely revealed, they may campaign against defensive competitive tactics applied by cooperative interests that are more noticeable compared to their own surreptitious or legitimized mode of operation. They may portray cooperative forces as competitive aggressors and themselves as conservative defenders of the society under the semblance of authorization they assumed by appropriating governmental power. They might succeed in reversing the perception of facts and manipulate sufficient segments of the population into believing that cooperative pursuits constitute dangerous disturbances against which the system must defend with coercion. Coercive counterpressure by cooperative interests may then not be a preferable solution to the coercive pressure or general subjection by competitive interests. Nevertheless, the chances of defeating coercive challenges are much higher than the apparent advantages of competitive rulers might suggest. These chances are founded on the cooperative mechanisms on which competitive interests in a representative cooperative system rely. Cooperatively minded individuals may apply existing cooperative institutions to claim and implement their rights. To the extent that does not succeed, they may use the underlying constructive processes in which cooperative interests are engaged and of which the system takes advantage. They might refuse to employ these structures and processes of cooperation in favor of competitive interests and might coordinate that refusal through some of these mechanisms. If the failure to cooperate is limited to lawful failure to participate in agreements or to other discretionary non-cooperation, competitive interests could not undertake an enforcement of their rule without breaking or changing the law. By such policy alterations and their enforcement, competitive forces would reveal their true nature. To the extent the withholding of cooperation with competitive powers might be considered a breach of contractual obligations, it must be reserved for the eventuality that competitive forces violate their contractual obligations first. By all measures, the competitive treatment of cooperative arrangements establishes such an original breach. Nonetheless, its proof would have to be specific and convincing. Here again, competitive interests might respond with intensified enforcement efforts that exceed legal limits, or they might modify existing laws to compel cooperation. This is likely to raise awareness in bystanding individuals who might join a passive resistance. Widespread enforcement against passive resistance involving the type of activity that is necessary to supersede non-action and coerce action is bound to drain competitive interests of resources. In addition, such enforcement efforts would have to include mistreatment that may galvanize cooperative interests beyond those individuals affected and risk increasingly active defensive reactions. This would elevate the threat to competitive control and access to resources. Open conflict may generate mutual devastation and may therefore be reserved by both sides as the last resort. Because cooperative interests are less prepared for conflict and may suffer greatly, they may apply mere passive resistance until their mistreatment approaches their suffering in conflict. But if victims systematically refuse cooperation, any form or level of escalation is bound to be won by cooperative interests because they provide essential means for the subsistence of any society. Oppressive rule must eventually collapse because it will be starved of the means to maintain its oppression apparatus. The escalation of oppression only accelerates such a development because it requires an intensified supply of means when that supply is decreasing, and securing it comes at greater cost. Confronted with mounting passive resistance by cooperative forces and a threat of widespread escalation that endangers their objectives and possibly their existence, competitive interests might be convinced to grant concessions commensurate with their waning ability to secure competitive advantages. Non-cooperation with competitive interests establishes a defensive stance and leads to the destruction of competitive domination. It does not necessarily establish a cooperative society. Yet individual engagement in passive resistance points to the foundation for a successful cooperative system. If we desire to preserve, improve, and maximize our happiness, we must elevate individual engagement to its proper function in the pursuit of our needs. This calls for us to leave a separate institutionalization of governance behind and supplant it with a cooperative mechanism that consists of and is responsive to individual participation. Our motivation arises from the recognition that reliance on somebody else's trusteeship for our needs and pursuits replaces us as necessary agents of our interests. Our insight into our needs for individual and collective survival and thriving and our struggles in a hierarchic system lead us to the realization that individual and common welfare are inseparable, and that neither can be generated or administrated separately from us. We have to reserve all matters of our happiness, including governmental concerns, to our consideration and judgment. To undertake this administration successfully, we must understand how to organize the pursuit of our needs with other individuals. The next chapter explores such a system of cooperative governance.